In his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins summarizes one of his main talking points in the following way. Quote, "The natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. In the case of a man-made artifact such as a watch, the designer really was an intelligent engineer. It is tempting to apply the same logic to an eye, or a wing, a spider, or a person. The temptation is a false one, because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. The whole problem we started out with was the problem of explaining statistical improbability. It is obviously no solution to postulate something even more improbable." Unquote. A humorous sketch from Dark Matter 2525 illustrates the same point.
Boo! Oh, it's just this Yahweh. He was an atheist. Was. Surprise, Sporty, I'm real. You're a vastly intelligent and complex being, Yahweh. Did you think nothing created you? You think you just created yourself?
Okay, but is this a good objection to theism? What I aim to do in this video is summarize some of the criticisms leveled against this kind of reasoning, but also show the weaknesses of typical theistic responses. To do that, I'll be summarizing this paper by Erik Wielenberg that I'll have linked in the description of this video. To restate the reasoning again, people who believe in God believe his existence accounts for what appears to be the intelligent design we observe around us. But, Dawkins argues, any designer that could possibly account for that would themselves have to be extremely complex in one way or another. In fact, even more so than the design itself. So, to explain the complexity we see around us, it looks like theists are appealing to something exponentially more complicated. And if complexity is the kind of thing that cries out for an explanation, then why wouldn't the mind of said designer? Surely the existence of such a designer is extremely improbable. So what's the problem? Well, most informed theists manifestly do not accept most of these crucial claims, nor are they typically tempted to accept them. To be fair, there's nothing inherently wrong with making an argument using disputable assumptions. But when someone does that, it's all the more important to provide a lot of support for what you're saying, and to rigorously deal with the potential responses your opponent has available to them. Wielenberg summarizes, quote, "A central element of my critique is that Dawkins' Gambit provides no reason at all to doubt some of the most widely held versions of the target of his attack, the God hypothesis. I do not know exactly how much theology one needs to know to disprove the existence of God, but one needs to know at least enough theology to understand the various widely held conceptions of God. In general, in order to argue effectively against a given hypothesis, one needs to know enough to characterize that hypothesis accurately." Unquote. For example, one move a theist could make in response to Dawkins is to suggest that a complex being doesn't require a further explanation if they exist necessarily, and God exists necessarily. The reason the complexity of the world we see around us does require an explanation outside of itself is because it's contingent, while God is not. Once a skeptic fairly considers this response, rather than simply hand-waving it away, what they should say is something like Wielenberg says, quote, "If the idea of necessarily existing complex entities makes sense, why not suppose that the natural complex phenomena themselves exist necessarily and have no external explanation?" Dawkins' Gambit seeks to establish that the God hypothesis is improbable. A different strategy involves making the case that the God hypothesis is unnecessary. It is hard to see a reasonable basis for admitting the possibility of a necessarily existing complex God, while denying the possibility of a necessarily existing complex four-dimensional universe. Unquote. Put another way, if complex things can necessarily exist, then what's wrong with the buck stopping at the universe? And by that I mean the totality of all natural causal reality. Why tack God onto our ontology if we can explain everything, or at least most things, just as well or better without him? Another option for the theist is to claim that God is fundamentally simple. Some people who claim to be describing a simple God aren't really doing that. But for the ones that are, this move invites the following worries. How could a simple God be personal? What does it even mean to say that a mind is fundamentally simple? Hume, through the mouth of Cleanthes, says the following, quote, "Though it be allowed that the deity possesses attributes of which we have no comprehension, yet ought we never to ascribe to him any attributes which are absolutely incompatible with that intelligent nature essential to him. A mind whose acts and sentiments and ideas are not distinct and successive, one that is wholly simple and totally immutable, is a mind which has no thought, no reason, no will, no sentiment, no love, no hatred, or, in a word, is no mind at all." Unquote. And appealing to mystery doesn't really help here, because the more unintelligibility you build into the God hypothesis, the less it seems able to explain. It essentially boils down to, in Wielenberg's words, the hypothesis that there exists a necessary, non-physical, simple, largely incomprehensible something or other that created the universe that has no external explanation. Okay, cool. But the term God has personal connotations. It also denotes being worthy of worship. But applying the term God to whatever that is seems nonsensical. Almost as nonsensical as what some Christians believe about the fall of Adam and Eve. Tap here and I'll explain the problem.